Why South Sudan? An Every Village podcast where we answer questions about the world's youngest nation. The question of the day is, what are the differences in the 64 tribes? Hello, everyone. My name is Tiana Johnston, and I am the host of this podcast called Why South Sudan? And it has been a joy for the last few episodes. We've gotten to hear from Blake Jones, but we have Andrew Brown, Executive Director of Every Village, back here in the hot seat.
Hey, Tiana.
It's good to have you back. I've enjoyed our banter over the last several podcasts, so it's exciting to have you back.
Yeah, it's been fun to be back. I got to be in Africa for about a month over Christmas break, and it's been awesome to be back.
It was, yes, you felt like you were gone for a very long time, but it's fun to have you back in the office. You definitely bring a fun dynamic to the team. So I decided to save this one for you, as we're going to talk about what are the differences in the 64 tribes. I know we don't work with all 64 tribes, as Blake hinted at and shared in the last episode. But yeah, just wanted to kind of hear from you, and yeah, let me hear it.
That's cool. Well, I thought it'd be a little fun to start this with some trivia about the number 64 in honor of our 64 tribes in South Sudan. And I'm kind of a numbers geek, so here you go. These are just some of the amazing facts about the number 64. See how many you know, Tiana. Talking to you before the podcast, I'm not sure you know these. Anyway, in mathematics, 64 is the first whole number that is both a perfect square and a perfect cube. Now, do you know what that means, Tiana?
Negative.
No, but the square root of 64 is 8, but the cube root of 64 is 4, which is pretty cool. So if you multiply 4 times itself 3 times, you get 64.
Excellent.
So anyway, that's kind of a cool mathematical fact about the number 64. Of course, for all you folks that are into science, I don't know this one actually at all, but apparently 64 is, there's 64 elements in the F block of the periodic table, which includes lanthanides and actinides, which I don't know anything about that. So I'm just talking about stuff I have no clue.
Excellent.
But in one that I do know about in technology, 64-bit processors is basically they're twice as fast as 32-bit processors, or so. Computers are typically 32-bit or 64-bit. So that's a good one. And thus, Nintendo 64, for people my age, we remember that growing up, and that was because Nintendo went to a 64-bit processor. And so...
Oh, that's a fun fact.
Yeah, Nintendo 64 was in honor of that. And then in pop culture, I like this one. The Beatles had a song, anybody know it? When I'm 64. And that's a song about aging and love. And then, of course, in sports, well, I don't know why this is called sports, so I'm reading it. This isn't really a sport. If you play chess, don't call it a sport. That's kind of nerdy. But in chess, there are 64 boxes on a chessboard. So squares on a chessboard. So
I'm going to go home and nerd out on my husband and make him think that I'm very smart.
For sure. So anyway, those are just some of the fun facts about 64.
That is fun.
Yeah.
And how many tribes are in South Sudan?
Wait for it. 64.
See, they should add that on your...
That's true. Yeah, in culture.
Exactly.
Yeah, 64 tribes in South Sudan. So what are the differences in those 64 tribes? Well, like any nation, there is diversity, of course, within South Sudan. And it's, just like in the United States, we've got people from all over the U.S. have different accents, different customs, different cultures. We know that to be true in the United States. South Sudan, can be thought of as a lump country, but there's a lot of diversity within that nation as well. And so these 64 tribes represent that. Let me break it down kind of at a high level first and say there's kind of a ancestral breakdown between Nilotic tribes, and then there's also Sudanic tribes, and then there's a few Bantu tribes as well in South Sudan. And these are all kind of related to ancient ancestry and the lines, tribal lines that they come from. But there's, all those Nilotics would be more closely related than, other tribes that are not Nilotic and so forth. So, the Nilotic tribes are the largest tribes in South Sudan. So most of the political parties are filled with Nilotic tribes. The two largest tribes in South Sudan are the Dinka and the Nuer. Both are Nilotics. But then there's a handful of other Nilotic tribes within South Sudan as well. And And then, the Sudanic tribes and the Bantu tribes are smaller tribes that have a bunch of those 64 tribes are made up of smaller tribes within those groupings. In general, if you look at a map of South Sudan, the southern region right along the border with Uganda and Kenya, that's where the Bantu tribes and the Sudanic tribes live. And so there's a lot of those small little tribes, some of them, 200,000 people total in that tribe or whatever. But then the farther north you go, the more you get into Nilotic territory. And you kind of got, in some ways, if you think about on the map, kind of a U shape all the way across from northwest to northeast is the Dinka. And then the Nuer kind of interspersed in the middle, and then kind of from kind of north central to northeast as well, the Nuer. And so the Bible has reference to the Nilotics in Isaiah. There's a couple different references in Ezekiel. There's some references in the Bible. They're called the Cushites, and even today in South Sudan, the people will refer to themselves sometimes ancient with ancient terms with Cush in terms of Cush, and Isaiah talks about this prophecy about the Cushites, and it says these tall, smooth-skinned warriors is what it says. Well, that's the Dinka, and we know that, right?
For sure.
I mean, you've seen it. They're very tall, some of the tallest people in the world. They are very smooth-skinned, and they are warriors. So that hasn't changed from ancient times. It talks about them in their, I think the King James Version says they're coracled boats, but these boats of reed, made out of reeds or bamboo or trees. And that's still the case today because South Sudan is just cut through the landscape is cut through by rivers, all deltas off of the Nile River, and so there's a land of rivers all over the place, and you see people every year they're cutting down palm trees or other types of trees and carving out their little wooden canoes, and that's how they get around for the rainy season into the swampy areas. That's where they do fishing. That's where they get around. To travel other places. So, it's kind of fun to see things that were written thousands of years ago in Scripture, and honestly, they haven't changed a whole lot, which is why I think I've probably mentioned before on this podcast that South Sudan today is it's more similar to life in the Old Testament than it is the modern world in many ways. Sure. And so, anyway, that's kind of just a breakdown in terms of how they're dispersed throughout the nation, and then, of course, the differences, the main differences between those Nilotic groups versus the Sudanic or Bantu groups. The Nilotics are typically cattle keepers, all of them. And so traditionally they were nomadic because they would follow around their cows wherever there was grass and water. And so, of course, in modern society, they've settled down a little bit, but still they're definitely more transient than other tribes. Particularly the young boys will travel around to take their cows to cattle camps during the dry season. So they take them miles and miles away to find swampy areas or whatever that still have water in the dry season. And that's a boy's dream, to grow up going into the cattle camp, taking care of his dad's cows, and they'll stay there for several months while it's dry. So as you can imagine, being a cattle keeping tribe, everything in their culture is centered around the cow, right? So, Tiana, about the naming conventions. I mean, you talk to me a little bit about the Dinka's love for cows, because I know you live there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So with the cows, I mean, a lot of people are actually named after the color of the cow. I think it's pretty amazing that literally every different print, I actually wasn't big into animal prints until moving over there. And I'm just like, there's one, and I totally forgot the name of it, but it literally looks like a black starry night. Like it's covered in black and it has white specks on it. It is just so beautiful. But even so, like my Dinka name is a Jok. And so what that means is basically it's white on top and black on bottom. That's like the color print of the cow. And Malawal is like a red cow, or
like I'm Mabur, or in one area of South Sudan they call me Mabur, which is a white bull, right?
Yeah, so they have like many different ones. But people are named after their cows because, one, cows mean so much to them culturally, but also to like ancestors. I mean, back in the day, I mean, like Malawal will be named after their great 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 uncle. It's because cows have been part of their history for years and years.
Yeah. So the Nilotic tribes love their cows. And really honestly, society and their culture is centered around that. And in their marriages, cows are a big part of the dowry payments, and it's just everything. So that's a huge part of Nilotic culture. But then the Sudanic tribes and Bantu tribes are typically more farmers, and so of course, as farmers, they love to cultivate. They're a lot more plant a lot more variety in their crops, whereas the Nilotics pretty much plant sorghum and some peanuts to supplement, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And so every year there's actually what's called the Hungry Month, and that's in August. It's before they've planted their seeds. They're waiting for the harvest to come, typically in September. And every August, pretty much, particularly the Nilotic tribes struggle with food insecurity, some at risk of starvation. If there's a famine or just bad crop
or a rainy season,
right?
Yeah.
And it's almost all subsistence farming, and so if bugs or rain or dryness or whatever, any of the natural elements come in and destroy a crop, the family suffers, and we see that sadly every year. The Bantus and Sudanics have a little bit more variety, so they've got more options. Also, the farther south you go in the country, it's a little bit more fertile. Although I would say even the northern parts of South Sudan are still very fertile if they have access to water. So that you start to get a little bit more arid. The Sahara Desert starts in North Sudan and then goes all the way across to the swath of Africa. South Sudan is not part of the Sahara. But the farther north you get, the more arid it is, but it's not a desert, because if you add water to that soil, it's very fertile. You can grow, crops quickly and easily. And so that's where, going back to our work in the access to water, it's so important beyond just drinking, but for agriculture as well.
For sure.
And so you start to see people building community farms now. It's not a big thing yet, but it's starting to pop up. And I love seeing that because people are understanding, together we can do more and grow more food and beat in food insecurity.
Yeah, there was, like in Taj specifically, there's a guy that was trained from another organization. I can't remember what it is, but they taught this style. It's called Farming God's Way. And so it's it's actually quite mathematical. Where you have...
Does it have to do with 64? Perfect cubes and perfect squares?
Maybe. A little complex, but... Because really, even learning to garden, the way that the Dinka do, they just throw seed. Of course, they toil the soil and, get it ready and prepared, but they just throw out seed. And of course, not everything's going to take, because some's actually going to be on bad soil, or some's not going to go all the way down deep enough for the roots, or the roots are gonna, just choke each other out. But what this gentleman learned is that he learned to do them in perfect rows and to space them out and everything so the roots could grow deep. But the key was that he was right next to the river, so he was literally just flushing in the water just to basically keep it, producing. And so we'd actually have to walk across the river. So imagine lifting you don't wear skirts, but for the girls you do have to lift your skirts to go and to walk across the river just to get produce. We would get pumpkin, and we would get sukuma wiki, which is I guess
greens.
Yeah,
yeah.
Would it be close to collard greens?
Yeah, close to collard greens.
Yeah. That or or eggplant. Yeah. Even a tomato. Man, a tomato has never tasted so good.
You are so true. Yes. It's funny because the simplest foods in South Sudan taste so much better.
Yes. Ooh, a papaya.
Yeah, anything. I think it's because you don't have access to fresh produce very often.
Totally.
So when you get it, it's just this is like heaven.
Totally. I was eating a tomato like it was an apple, which probably showed me how much deficiency I was in vitamins, but it was so delicious.
Yeah.
But just that, having access to water, because even I was looking through some of our pictures from South Sudan, and I saw that someone actually was made a garden right next to the water well. And I was like, oh man, that's so genius, because they have access to the well and they can easily just water the plants, and they have a fence around it and everything so the goats don't get in it. But I think that is just another way of our wells being useful too. For
sure. And I saw that on this trip that I was just recently on. For the first time, I started seeing several community gardens, and that's a sign of education, but it's a sign of access to water, and it's a sign of unity in a nation, which is really cool. People coming together and building their nation together, which is really special. Just going back to some of the differences in the tribes beyond agriculture and husbandry, but you got the spiritual differences as well. And so traditionally, of course, most of South Sudan are animistic, African tribal religion, worship of spirits, the appeasement of spirits through sacrifices. So it's very common, witchcraft in general, but there are certain tribes that are known to be kind of the places you go for the most powerful witch doctors. And even within witchcraft, there's a couple different types of witch doctors. There's the traditional witch doctor, which is someone you'd go to for healing. And so if you have a sick family member, you'd go and make some payment. Typically, traditionally it'd be a goat or a chicken or whatever, in-kind gift and or payment. And then the witch doctor will put together some potion or some ritual or whatever, and that will lead, thought to lead to the healing of the individuals. But then there are rainmakers, people that you go to if you need rain. But then the one that I've had a lot of interaction with, which is really fascinating, is the spearmaster in South Sudan. And I know, Tiana, you've known some spearmasters too, and those are again going back to the Bible, a lot of this overlaps. But Balaam in the Book of Numbers was basically a spearmaster. This is someone, we are familiar with voodoo doctors, right? That's what it is. It's someone you go to and you pay them to call curses down on your enemies or blessing for your family. And those are probably the most feared type of witch doctor, because of course they hold the power to someone's life, oftentimes through curses. And so that's very common. There's a tribe called the Luo tribe, which is not far. They're part of the Tanj community where we work, and they're known to have lots and lots of spearmasters. And you see them walking around town with their spears, and and people definitely fear them for sure. So those are some of the differences as well. And we've seen, the gospel has made its way into different tribes in different ways, over the last few decades. And some tribes, there's still tons of witchcraft. Some tribes or some areas of the country have seemed to have more progress with the church to work against that. But there is a lot of syncretism still, where basically, a church overlaps their faith with traditional beliefs. And so not uncommon for people to go to church, but then go to a witch doctor afterwards, and they don't think there's any conflict there. They've merged those two aspects of their faith. And so those are some of the differences there. And to speak to Every Village's strategy, we have really felt called to build in areas where there's not really anybody else's foundation, where there's maybe a few other ministries in the regions we're working, but doing different types of work. But we're not wanting to go into areas where people already have access to a whole lot. So we're going to very remote, difficult to reach places in South Sudan. As an example, on my recent trip, we just built our own airstrip. Every village did, and we landed on that airstrip for the very first time in the history of that community. Really amazing stuff to go to pioneer places. And some of these places, haven't seen foreigners in a decade or more. So that means all the kids that are under that age have never seen a white skin. It's kind of funny. You see some kids that are curious, some kids that are scared, and, and they just go screaming, running off, right?
Yes. I finally, when I was able to understand the language, and I would go visit a friend's house, and the little kids would run away, and I'm like, why are they so scared? And then finally, when I learned the language, I learned that the older siblings were telling them that the white person will eat them, and I'm like, stop telling them, I will not eat them.
So funny, and they'll believe you. I mean, they're in a world. It's hard for us to imagine because America is so diverse, and we have so much access to the world, that we've pretty much seen everything on the Discovery Channel or whatever, right?
For sure.
But they're in a world they've literally never...
Yes.
They didn't know that there were humans that looked like this.
For sure. And even not even having a mirror, they don't even know what they themselves look like. Yes. And so when you live in a place where literally every single person has the same skin type, the hair, eyes, everything is so similar. But then that also counteracts with people that are born with disabilities or poor, I remember this mom bringing her daughter. She had some kind of, and it's genetic, there's literally nothing you can do, that her pigmentation was changing on her lips and around her lips, and it was turning white. And they're just like, what's wrong with her? She has a curse and everything. And it's just no, this is actually just genetics. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with her. She's absolutely beautiful just the way she is. But it's the fact of that she's different.
Yeah, and that's what Michael Jackson had.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And eventually he took matters in his own hands and
That's true. And then
turned into a creepo. But sorry, am I supposed to say that?
Sorry for all of you Michael Jackson fans.
That's right. Well,
he's still great. He's still
that's
great.
right.
Well,
And we can cut this out of the podcast.
That's true. Okay, very well.
All right. So, continuing the differences, just a few more differences. One of the things, again, we could look from the outside and say, oh, this is a very homogenous culture because it all looks similar. And yet there are definitely these nuanced differences in their housing as well. So the way they make the mud huts. Now, everybody in South Sudan pretty much is living in mud huts, but there are different styles of mud huts, right?
Yep.
Interestingly, in Upper Nile, which is in the northeast portion of the country, it's just fascinating. But pretty much all the mud huts at the top of the grass roof, comes to a point, and they make these metal or wooden little ornaments basically that cover the cap of the mud hut, and they're pretty intricate in their unique designs. They love that. It's a beauty thing for them. But that's not the case in a lot of other parts of South Sudan. They don't put any cap on the top of their mud hut, or even how they build the mud hut. You'll see the sticks with the mud walls, but you'll see the sticks all around the outside of the mud. Some it's on the inside, and so you can't see. Some they make mud bricks. Some are, most of them are roundish, but nowadays there's a lot of places that are making square or rectangular mud huts. It's kind of fascinating, right?
Yeah. I mean, even some areas, even out far in the village around Taj, that they put them on stilts because it floods so much. And I was like, oh, that's genius, like Galveston.
That's right. And then going back to the animals, if you pass a compound and it's got this one huge mud hut, it's not for the husband, it's not for the wife, it's for their cows or for their goats, it's for their animals, right?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, they're going to do everything they can to make sure that they're taking care of their animals because that's their wealth, that's their livelihood. And so just kind of fascinating stuff there. And so, we love the beauty of the South Sudanese people, and it's a joy to work with them. So I think I got distracted earlier, but, every village has chosen to really work primarily among the Nilotic tribes because, again, we see they're the most influential tribes in South Sudan, being the largest and the most powerful politically and community-wise. But then also they're the least reached. And so the areas where we're going, there's really almost nobody else working in these areas, just a few other ministries that are awesome ministries as well. But we're working in partnership with them, or we're certainly hand in hand trying to reach this nation for Christ. But we've made that choice. And so we've intentionally chosen not to focus on the southern region that's right across the border from South Sudan because, we've talked about it on the podcast before. South Sudan's the size of Texas, and there's only 200 miles of paved road. It's a very inaccessible place. But the southern border there is more access because it's right next to Uganda where there are paved roads so people can drive across the border and it's a lot easier. We can't do that. We literally have to fly into our locations, land on dirt airstrips and so very, very remote. So, that's just some of the differences and then why every village has chosen to work in the tribes that we're working in. And, each one of them has a different language, but I love that, God has provided some really awesome tools. Of course, the radio stations, we're hiring local staff so they can preach in the local languages. But then, in recent years, God's helped us partner with the Jesus Film, where the Jesus Film is translated into all the languages that we're working in. And it's just amazing. So people have access to see the gospel, see the Jesus story in their own heart tongue. It makes such a difference. I mean, imagine, even if I don't know another language, but even if I did, it would be tough to really connect at a heart level if I was listening to it in Spanish or in French and or whatever. And it's the same way for anybody. Even if they know a second language, it touches the heart in a different way when it's in their mother tongue. So anyway, those are just some of the differences of the 64 tribes in South Sudan. And so let's go play some Nintendo 64.
All right, break. No. That was so great. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was fun.
All right, I think now is a good time to invite everyone back to the next episode as we answer the question, what do you play on your radio stations? Take care.